Could South Africa be on the verge of its biggest immigration crackdown yet? As pressure mounts on President Cyril Ramaphosa to act, many are asking whether illegal foreigners will finally be sent home. What happens next could change the country forever. If you believe Ramaphosa is going to send all illegal foreigners home, like this video, and subscribe for more South African news and analysis.
Now, as South Africa grapples with growing tensions over illegal immigration and anti-foreigner protests, all eyes will be on President Cyril Ramaphosa when he addresses the nation this evening. The president faces the delicate task of responding to legitimate concerns around border management and undocumented migration, while also preventing further diplomatic fallout with the neighbouring countries, but also safeguarding South Africa's standing on the continent. The recent violence has already prompted concerns from several African governments, with some foreign nationals returning home amid fears for their safety. For insight into how the president can navigate this complex and sensitive issue, I am joined on the line by Thembisa Fagute, who's a senior research fellow at Africa-Asia Dialogues. Thembisa, good to have you on the program this afternoon. Firstly, the president finds himself in a very interesting balancing act. What do you anticipate, especially when competing with these realities? I mean, public frustration over illegal immigration, but also growing concerns about xenophobia as well. How does he strike the balance without alienating either side in this debate?
Well, it's a difficult play by the president. I think he has to be quite firm in his position, particularly to mention that South Africa is not xenophobic, as already said whilst he was addressing the press conference alongside President William Ruto of Kenya, that South Africans have been welcoming for the past 30 years or so of African brothers and sisters coming to this country. But at the same time, I think the president has to be firm in terms of particularly ensuring South Africans that he will communicate to all these countries that it's their failure of governance that has led these people to come to South Africa, both legal and illegal immigrants that continue to flow into this country. And unless politics are rectified in these countries and there's economic development, you are likely to see this continuing happening. And this one-way street of flowing of immigrants into South Africa will continue. So that communication has to be made very clear that the failure of African governments in making sure that they expand democracy, freedom of expression and political participation, including economic activities within their countries, will not help in terms of dealing with this current problem that we have with South Africa.
As this debate also continues, a lot's been said about South Africa's relation with other governments on the African continent as well. So several African countries have expressed concern following recent attacks on foreign nationals. But what diplomatic damage has already been done? And how serious is it, especially when considering South Africa's relationships with other governments on the continent?
Well, South Africa has got a role to play and is respected by many countries. And it has been helpful in terms of dealing with this, including its relationship with the other African governments. I think there is an understanding at the government level of what's been happening. And unfortunately, the situation is blown out of proportion, notwithstanding, of course, that the South African civil society has been very active in terms of fighting back the attacks on African brothers and sisters who come to this country. And there hasn't been, extreme violence, as it's mentioned on social media. And unfortunately, these African governments, and also including some of the senior officials within governments, case in point Ghana, have been reacting based on social media postings and social media activities suggesting that there's xenophobia and mass attacks on African immigrants in South Africa, which is not necessarily the truth. South Africans have been very active on both sides of the divide when it comes to this matter. You've got civil society that's been very strong in condemning those that are taking African immigrants, and you've got a government that's been also very strong, including the security apparatus in this country that has been sending stern messages to those who intended disrupting the businesses of foreign nationals in this country, including our taking them.
Yeah. Also interesting is that South Africa has historically positioned itself as a champion of African unity, Mr. Faguta, and Pan-Africanism as well. How does then the current anti-immigration sentiment undermine that image?
I don't think it does undermine. I don't think it undermines African unity, our role in trying to foster a strong African unity. But at the same time, it's an urgent matter that needs to be addressed. South Africa can't continue with this as business as usual because, correctly said, you have hundreds and thousands of illegal immigrants in this country who continue to flow in. And the unfortunately economic platforms and social platforms in this country are getting suffocated because of this. And now you have South Africans who are taking up this matter because there's a lack of governance. There's been some dragging of feet. We've been having corrupt officials at border levels. We've been also having corrupt officials at home affairs levels. So there's been this free flow of illegal immigrants coming to this country. And we had to wait for it to break before we could fix it. And it's unfortunate, of course, that this tends to be the case in most government departments where there's supposed to be a failure or breaking of some sort before the official could act. And one, of course, hopes that with what the government intends doing now in terms of rectifying this is going to be more effective. But I still don't support the idea of sending envoys because I think that would be an extra waste of money, notwithstanding, of course, that we've got embassies and people trusted with that responsibility in all of these countries. Now we hear that the president might announce envoys going into these countries, which I think would be a waste of money and unnecessary and wasteful expenditure.
As we continue discussing scenarios as well, if the president then focuses heavily on enforcement and deportations as well, could that be interpreted by neighboring countries or states as validating this anti-foreigner sentiment?
Yeah, well, I can hardly hear you, but I think what you're trying to say is again, a similar response I'll give, that the pushback that we're seeing within South Africa is justified. But for me, of course, what I think is worth mentioning is the tribalism factor that's creeping into this legitimate cause that many South Africans believe has to be addressed proper, professionally, legally. And now we have some of these bigots and tribalists who are taking advantage of the situation, wielding weapons in public in front of the police, pushing other Africans away. But the trapping, of course, is that most of these people, when all has been said and done, people that are going to be affected by and large are going to be South Africans, because what we've seen happening from a certain cabal coming from a certain province is that anyone who can't speak isiZulu, for example, is targeted as a foreigner. And in the absence of proper leadership from government, you are likely to have South African impacted by this, because if you don't speak a particular language and you come from a particular province and with a different complexion, you are regarded as outside. And this is why this could just be out of control. And I think at the end of the day, you are likely to have more South Africans impacted by this violence, and the South African government has to move very quickly in making sure that it stops this before it gets worse.
With that said, and of course, as we wrap our conversation, when the president concludes his address tonight, Tembisa, what key commitments or assurances would you like to hear that could reassure South Africans and the broader African community here in this situation?
And the sound is a bit bad, but I'll try and answer what you've been saying. I think it's about assuring South Africans that the government is going to try and do and help the situation and arrest it before it gets worse. Hopefully, that's going to be the case. We don't know what the president is going to be saying, but I think the emphasis and what everybody else has been indicating since this morning is that he's going to be sending envoys, is going to go and assure African countries that South Africa is doing much. But I think we shouldn't be on the back foot. We shouldn't go there apologetic. South Africa is doing much, as I've said. All the clusters of government and civil society are doing much in terms of ensuring that this doesn't get out of control. Of course, there is a sizable grouping that seeks to disturb all these efforts that have been taken in terms of constructive engagement in trying to rectify the current situation. And one hopes that the government is going to try and do as much as it can to allay fears. But importantly, in those countries, particular countries that are affected and impacted by this are going to be reassured as we enter Africa. South Africa is very involved in Africa Continental Free Trade Area, for example, that is likely to be disturbed by this violence. Not long ago, eThekwini hosted the tourism Indaba, hoping and looking at African tourism coming our way, and it's largely people from that province who are basically pushing back tourists from coming into eThekwini or South Africa in general. And it's not only going to impact on tourists coming from African countries, but also tourists who come from other South African provinces that are going to be impacted.
Mr. Fagute, let me thank you for your time, of course, adding his voice to this very contentious debate around immigration issues.